So, welcome. This is the Readings from Oconomowaukee virtual event series. I'm Daniel Golden from
And I'm
Boswell.
Lisa Bedoin.
Boswell, we like to say how many days we've been in business. It's 4,318.
And it's such a joy to be welcoming Sandy McCall Smith to our series Readings in Oconomowaukee. And I have to say, it's been since 1998 when the #1 Ladies Detective Agency was published. At that time, he was just 50 years old. So think about the number of books that have come in between. In the years since, we've spent much time with Precious Rama-Watsi, and we were introduced to new characters and series that have soothed us and filled us with bouts of laughter. And we have brought our young ones into Sandy's world through his storytelling with his children's books, which many of you don't realize that that's where he started, was with children's books. Before becoming a full-time writer, Sandy was a professor of medical law. He is currently involved in many side projects, including the Great Tapestry of Scotland project, which I'm hoping he'll talk a little more about. And when I was doing a little research, it sounds like Sandy's been a writer since he could hold a pencil and write. When he was just 8, he submitted a story to a publisher, and they wrote back with really kind words of encouragement, saying perhaps, you know, he had a future publishing opportunities and he should stick with it. So here we are today with over 100 published books and countless numbers of notebooks filled with stories, notes, bits of dialogue, all the little parts that Sandy writes down that goes into all the novels and stories that we hear. And today we're going to chat about his new collection of short stories, Pianos and Flowers. It's based on photographs that he selected from the Sunday Times photographic archives. So each one was sort of inspired by a photo. So we're really excited, and welcome, Sandy.
Thank you very much indeed, Lisa. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for the invitation, and hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be able to speak to you through Zoom today. I usually do a lot of touring. I haven't been doing much touring this year. In fact, I've been doing no touring this year, but I feel that I'm still able to be in touch with the readers, and I hope that the next time we talk, we'll be there together in the flesh, so to speak.
Why don't you start off talking a little about how the book came together? It's such an interesting story.
Well, yes, this new book, Pianos and Flowers, has rather an interesting background to it, in that some years ago, I was invited by an American photographic historian, Robert Flynn Johnson, to write an introduction to a book that he had written about orphaned photographs. And I'll just hold it up there. It's a book called Being Human. And you see a couple of young ladies jumping across the cover there. And what had happened was that he discovered that he had a very large collection of black and white photographs that nobody knew anything about. These are photographs that all of us have got somewhere in the house. You know, we've got them in the loft or in a cupboard somewhere. The old photographs, family photographs, often with no idea of what's going on in them or who the people are. And he had this wonderful collection of these photographs, and he asked me to write an introduction to that volume. And I could have written an introduction which talked about the attractions of old black and white photographs, et cetera, et cetera. But I decided rather to write stories about a number of these photographs in his collection. Just imagine what is happening in these rather peculiar photographs. And I so enjoyed it that I then decided to do a whole book on that. And I did my first book of photographic stories called Chance Developments. And there you'll see a picture of a man in a rather smart white hat sitting on that lady's lap. And that was one of the photographs that I was shown. And I thought, well, you know, what's going on here? And I decided to make up a story about a Canadian circus based in Vancouver, BC, but it toured over the border in Washington State and elsewhere, Oregon and that general part of the world. And that lady she's a ventriloquist, and she's got a ventriloquist doll of whom she's very fond. And there's a terrible fire in the circus, and her doll is burnt to a crisp. And so she's despairing, how's she going to do her act? And this chap is the lion tamer. And he says he rather likes her. He says, well, I'll pretend to be a ventriloquist doll. Can I sit on your lap? And so he goes in and he sits on his lap and pretends to talk. And of course, the show goes down really, really well. So that was chance developments, a number of those photographs. And then I was asked by the Sunday Times newspaper in the UK to write stories, and a series of 6 stories for them. And I said, well, let me loose in your photographic archive, and I'll find odd photographs that you've got, and I'll spin a story around them. So they did that. And from that emerged this book, Pianos and Flowers. And the photographs are really rather strange because we don't know anything about them. We don't know what's going on in these photographs. And of course, I can then just invent a story associated with them. So there are, I forget how many stories there are in the book, 10 or something like that. But here's one example. That photograph there, which people may be able to see, is of a large building which is falling down. And in the corner, you can see a man walking away, a man in a suit walking away in a purposeful fashion. So the big building in the back is falling down. Sorry, it's probably not terribly clear. But what is happening in that photograph? Well, I wrote this story on the basis that the man in the suit walking away from this collapsing building was an architect. And he's going home to have words with his mother. And he goes back, he lives with his mother. He goes back to his mother and says, "Mother, did you interfere with those drawings that I left on my table?" And she says, "What, me? No, no, no." And he says, "No, come on, did you interfere?" She says, "Yes, well, I thought that there was one wall too much and that one of the rooms would have been..." There we are. Ah, beautiful, thank you. Okay.
Yes.
Well, there we are. There he is, you see. That building has had a rather unfortunate experience. And you can see the architect is walking away from that in a very purposeful fashion.
And it looks like his cheeks are sucked in too.
Oh yes, well he's pretty cross. He's
Yes.
pretty cross with his mother. And in fact, I think I might be able to find the paragraph where he has words with his mother. And no, I can't find it. But anyway, he goes back, and interestingly enough, that came from a real experience I had, in that I was at a dinner party in the north of Scotland some years ago, and I found myself sitting next to somebody who'd been a very distinguished civil engineer in the Far East, and he'd been in charge of some very big projects in various Far Eastern countries and was now retired. And I was talking to him about this, and his wife was there with him, and he said, "Actually, you know, my wife used to interfere with my drawings." And this chap built bridges. So that came out in that story.
That actually leads into a question that I was actually hoping to ask you. Did the stories, did you see a photo and you're like, I know that story, or being that I know that your head is so filled with stories because you write, like you have such an imagination and you can write so many books. So your head, it's just like, I can see all these stories jumping through your brain all the time. So did you sometimes say, that's the perfect photo for a story I already have? So which came first?
Usually the photograph suggests the story. So I wouldn't go to the photograph with an idea already in my head, but I'd look at a photograph. And I mean, it's really interesting to try this. Take a look at an odd photograph and say to yourself, who are those people in the photograph? What's their relationship? What's happening to them? And then before you know it, the whole backstory comes into existence, and you may see something about the photograph that really strikes one. I don't know, Daniel, whether you can get. I'll just see whether you can put up on the screen one of these stories that would illustrate that, where the idea. I'll find it. Here we are. I'll give you the page number. It's opposite page 163 of the book.
I have about 9, 8. I think I have 8 of the photos.
I don't think we have the pogo one.
It's the pogo stick.
Yeah, I don't think we have the pogo stick one.
Well, let me see whether I can put it there.
Yeah. There are a couple of ones we didn't get that I actually took photos of to put up, but I didn't.
That's the pogo stick. Can you see there's a young man bouncing on a pogo stick there? Sorry, it's probably not clear enough.
Yeah, it worked.
It was okay.
Anyway, so when I saw that, I thought, what can I possibly write about that? I was able to identify the place in that photograph. I had no idea who the people were, but I was able to identify the place, and it was Cambridge in England, and it was the University of Cambridge. And of course, the University of Cambridge was a place where some very important pioneering work was done on DNA, the discovery of DNA. And so I said, well, that's 2 of those famous scientists, Messrs. Watson and Crick, who of course discovered the double helix structure of DNA. That's them there. They've been a bit bored in the lab, and they've gone out, and somebody had a pogo stick, and they said, let's have a bounce on the pogo stick. And then they take the pogo stick back into the lab, and they look at it. And Watson says to Crick, look at the structure of that spring. It goes round like this. Double helix. DNA. So, that's just ridiculous, but nonetheless. So the stories suggest themselves. And of course, this is the way that stories come, I think. I think much fiction is made up by the subconscious mind operating away in a rather anarchic fashion in the background. And so I will see people or places, or I will hear something being said, which will create a story in my mind. I find it very interesting if I go into a restaurant, for example, sitting there in a restaurant, I pay no attention to what I'm eating. I really watch what's going on at the other tables, and I find myself speculating about the people. Who are these people? Why are they meeting together? And then the mind comes up with the stories, or listening to snippets of conversation. You hear things that people say, and people say very extraordinary things if you listen to what they.
True.
there was, I know you had some very strange. My wife and I were going for a bike ride the other day, and we rode past these people two women who were going for a walk. And as we went past, one turned to the other and said, "The thing about Pete is he is always so cheerful." And then we moved on, and we didn't. And I found myself thinking, who's this Pete? Why is Pete so cheerful? Is there this is as a novelist, you have to open yourself up to conversations, listening to other people's conversations. I find it very frustrating when I hear people talking on their cell phones, because you only hear one side. You really want to hear what's going on the other side. And I feel that when people are on trains and talking on their cell phone, they should be required by the railway company to plug them into the public address system so that you can hear both sides of the
at the minimum speakerphone.
Oh, yeah. Speaker.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and the cell phones these days, you can often hear the response if you're anywhere near, because they're so loud.
Well, that's a very positive development for novels.
Thank goodness.
Or the cars. I can walk out into our parking lot and hear both conversations in the car.
Oh, because it comes in through a speaker.
Yeah, and it's so loud.
This, of course, is an ancient device for, say, writers of mystery fiction. Yes. Somebody overhears a telephone conversation. I mean, I'm sure that Alfred Hitchcock used that in some of his films, weren't there? There was that device used to
well, right. I mean, certainly nosiness is a very important component of an Alfred Hitchcock film.
Yep.
You got to get into other people's business.
Yep. That's right.
So when you're traveling, do you find yourself veering into antique stores and, you know, going through all the old photographs and just like plucking? Have you developed a collection of your own now?
Well, interestingly enough, I've tried to get some old photographs, and I remember at home we had biscuit tins, cookie tins of old photographs, old family photographs, which I don't know what's happened to them, but everybody had those old black and white photographs. And then I remember a period when you could get them in garage sales and antique shops and whatnot. Nowadays you can't. You don't really see them. You see postcards. There are lots of these old postcards, and of course the postcards are often quite interesting because there's a message on the back. But they become quite expensive. And photographs, I did last year. I decided to get some on eBay. I noticed that somebody was advertising old black and white photographs on eBay, and I thought, well, this will be interesting because I'm sure I'll get something which will inspire a story. So I bought, I think, 50 unseen black and white photographs, and they came and they were very dull. There was nothing really that, there was one where I found myself a bit intrigued as to what was going on in the photograph, but no, I think one's more likely to see that in published collections of old photographs. Yeah. They're just fascinating.
It's like when I would order stamps from that catalog and they'd all just be not that interesting.
Well, there's still quite a few here in Wisconsin because I've lost many hours going through old tins at antique stores of photos, and I have quite a stack. So if you're ever bored, I'll email them to you.
Well, it's if you find any that are really funny.
Oh yeah.
I'd be interested in seeing them. No, it's a wonderful pursuit. I mean, Daniel, you mentioned stamps. Again, I think that's a fascinating thing to look at an old stamp album. I inherited an old stamp album which is full of the most beautiful old stamps, nothing terribly valuable, but really wonderful old stamps from countries which have ceased to exist. It's the other thing that that it's a real lesson in historical geography when you see these various territories. In fact, there's a rather interesting book that somebody wrote, a Scottish writer wrote a book called Whatever Happened to Tanganyika, which is a study of all these countries that you see in the old stamp albums. What happened to them when they disappeared. Of course, they changed their names. And of course, their histories their stamps tend to say a lot about their histories.
I'm going to try to figure out if that book's, I do not believe that book is still available. I'm just guessing that book isn't available, but I think I would be very interested in reading it if it was. I'm going to share, since we have the share screen, I'll pull up, maybe you tell a little about one or two of the photographs and how you were inspired.
Yep.
Let's go with that one, Duty.
That I found that a very intriguing photograph, because when you look at these things, you'll see that there's detail in the background that may tell you an awful lot about the context. And so there we have these two women, two young women. I decided that they were related because they look as if they're related. They could be twins. And then you see that's the Labor Department that they're standing, the Labor Exchange. In fact, you can see inside, you can see some people lining up. It's not very clear because there's a bit of a shine on the photograph there. You also can date the photograph sometimes fairly accurately. There's something in the background which is Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, I think, at the back. And I would say that is probably First World War. I'd say that that's early 20th century, you know, between 1914 and 1918, something like that. There's recruiting at the back, which suggests that it's that the military are recruiting at the time. We've got a post box in the front, which has got a notice in front of it, which may have something to do with conscription or whatever. And so I just told their story. And that was an example of somewhere where the photograph just gives you your two characters. It doesn't really tell you too much about it, other than that I put them in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and one of them was quite good at marching and the other one wasn't. And so there was tension in that. And then, of course, I like to tell the story of people over a big historical sweep, end up in Australia and so on.
Yes, you do have a sweep. The stories go all over the place. So.
And I really liked too how they were very specific to those people, but you brought in bits of history that, you know, corners of history I didn't also know about. So I learned a lot. Well,
I think that you can actually paint, you can paint a picture of an entire life and an entire epoch from a photograph. You can see, and also they can be very poignant. I find that when I look at old photographs, I think, gosh, all of those people are no longer with us. There they are. What happened to them? What individual dramas? What passions? What tragedies? What moments of triumph are shown in that? Just in a random photograph. And when you realize also some photographs, you realize they're taken just before a very important historical event, and that makes one think of the significance. So, you know, if you see a photograph of President Kennedy arriving at Love Field Airport in Dallas on that dreadful day, you see the people standing in the crowds. Those people, there they are. They don't know that they're about to be involved in an historical event which is going to echo throughout the world, and so on. It really is. There's so much in these photographs,
and it really does capture that moment. I'm sorry, Daniel. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. I was just going to ask if we wanted to do another photograph.
Let's do another photograph. Yes.
Let's do another one.
I'm enjoying it.
Let me call out a story, and I'll see if it's one that I have.
Well, have you got a photograph of the two boys on the hillside with the horse?
Yes.
That's it. Beautiful. That's great. It's a lovely photograph, that. So I knew, I looked at that photograph, and without having to be told anything about it, I recognized that's very close to home. That's the Highlands of Scotland. The great sweep of hills, and that's a sweep of hills. And in fact, what we see there is that those two have shot a deer, and the deer is being taken back down to probably on one of these Highland estates on the back of the pony, those very sure-footed ponies that they use. And so I actually had that. I decided that those two boys are sort of teenagers, and one of them, one has a father who owns the estate, the other is a friend who's come. And I talk about their relationship, and I talk about how they find themselves years later. They find themselves, in fact, not all that many years later, they find themselves in Greece, where they are fighting in the hills with the Greek resistance during the Second World War, and then they don't see one another. So that gives us a bit of the sweep until much later on, when they are at a school reunion. And if I could just read, I'll read. It's only half a page. At the school reunion, they see one another when they're in their 30s, see one another again after all those experiences. The school organized a reunion at which both Bruce and David were present. The school pipe band played in the quad, although it had started to rain, the soft, intermittent rain of the Scottish Highlands. As he watched the boys marching past in their kilts, the Highland pipes vocal in their lament, David thought, nobody is going to ask those boys to go to Greece. Nobody's going to expect of them what was expected of us. And what was that? To do what needed to be done, because a monstrous evil had shown its face, or because humanity had simply behaved in the way in which it had behaved throughout history and had squabbled and fought over grubby issues of territory. No, he thought, that's too cynical. It was not like that. It had been far simpler. It had been about bullying and cruelty and the strutting of dark gods. Bruce stood beside him. David said, do you remember something? Bruce waited. You said in Greece one day that you'd cried buckets at my funeral. Do you remember? Bruce smiled. Did I say that? Yes, you did. Well, I suppose I would. David felt the rain upon his face. I meant to say the same thing, he said. He paused. In the lives of most of us, the list of unsaid things was, he thought, a long one. So it's about friendship, and it's about the importance of saying things that you need to say, and that when we look back at our lives, inevitably, we will be aware of many occasions when we didn't say what we wish now we had said.
You have such a strong, there's so much emotion in your stories that you pull from the photos. That is one of the things, nowadays, the short story, with the decline of magazines taking stories, they've become much more, at least in the United States, really an exercise for writing schools. So a lot of authors have if they go to a writing program, have a short story collection, but those are very different kinds of stories than the traditional short stories that we saw before. And so when some people tell me, well, I'm not really a short story person, they often mean those kind of more academic exercises.
Yeah.
You really bring kind of old-fashioned plot and emotion, just like you would in a novel that you might not always see in contemporary.
I agree. I mean, I very much enjoy the classic short story of the sort that we don't really, I think, for reasons that you've been addressing there, we don't see so much of today, but they still can have tremendous impact. A short story can have terrific impact. You can create a whole world in a short story. You have to tell a story. I think that's sometimes lost in the modern short story. It's about impressions, and it's about observations, but you don't actually necessarily have the story. One of the great practitioners of the genre was Somerset Maugham. I think Somerset Maugham is just wonderful, and I can still read Somerset Maugham with the greatest enjoyment. His short stories, particularly his short stories set in Burma, as it then was, or Malaya as it then was, are extraordinarily powerful. The emotion that goes into them. And then, of course, there's so many other practitioners of the short story, which short stories which are really intensely readable.
And I love a short story too. Yeah. And they pack that just like, and people will say, I'm not a short story reader, but they'll also say, and this is a good segue, I don't read poetry. Yep. And I think, poetry does the same thing. It packs an experience or a story. And sometimes in life, we don't need a novel, we need a short story, and sometimes we need a poem because they do different things for us.
Exactly. And I think most people who say that they don't read poetry then will come across poetry. If they do come across poetry, they'll be so pleasantly surprised, and they'll realize, I think maybe they might have had a bad experience of poetry when they were at school, when they're very young and they have to learn 50 lines of Longfellow or something. Which, of course, I take Longfellow seriously because I think he wrote about your neck of the woods, really.
Yes.
But I think poetry continues to surprise, and of course, there are contemporary poets who are such great fun that people read them, and they're really. For example, I very much like Billy Collins' work. His poetry is surprising. It's wonderful. And my great literary enthusiasm, of course, is W.H. Auden. Auden was the most wonderful, humane voice, and the gravity of some of his great poems is just so extraordinary. I read Auden regularly. I take Auden's collected shorter poems with me when I travel.
Do you?
Yeah, I do. And I would put it in the suitcase, and I would read Auden.
Yeah.
Lisa, do you want to ask a question, or should I?
No,
We were talking beforehand about your experiences in Milwaukee, and I thought we could, since probably good half the people here are from Milwaukee. This is not your first, well, it's your first virtual time in Milwaukee, but it's certainly not your first time in Milwaukee.
Yeah. No, I have been before, and I remember it with great pleasure. I remember staying in a wonderful hotel in Milwaukee, and the warmth. I like your part of the world. I like the courtesy, and I'm not just saying this because I'm speaking to people from Wisconsin or thereabouts. But there's a wonderful courtesy in your part of the world, and in the Midwest. You know, if you go even going further down into for regions further south, people are still very polite to one another, which I find really very nice indeed. And sometimes when you encounter that sort of politeness in the modern world, which has become so fast and so furious and so impersonal, you're very struck by it. I remember being years ago visiting Mobile, Alabama. Now I know that's the opposite end of the country from you, but being there and going out of my hotel in Mobile, and a person was walking towards me, and nobody else was around. It wasn't very busy. And he said, "Good morning." And I thought, this is marvelous. This is a place where you go out of your hotel. And I went further up the street, and a second person said, "Good morning." And you know, this is terrific. It was like going back in time to the days when I was talking to a friend of mine who used to be a leader of a political party in Scotland. And he said that he was walking in Edinburgh, walking up the street, going in towards our Scottish Parliament some years ago. And there weren't many people around. So as he was walking along the street, somebody approached him, walking in the opposite direction. And as he drew level with him, my friend quite politely said, "Good morning." And the other man looked at him and he said, "Good morning, but I'm not going to vote for you." Which I think is a pity.
Tell people what you wanted to do when you went to Las Vegas. We had the
Well, when I went to Las Vegas, this is years ago. I think it was my first visit to Las Vegas. I addressed a lunch at the Las Vegas Literary Society, and I was asked how I would like to spend the afternoon, and so I said I'd like to go to the Liberace Museum because Liberace, in my view, was a remarkable entertainer. He was, by all accounts, a very kind man, which I think is very important in this life, in that I think that's one of the great moral pluses in somebody's favor. If they are kind, if they're kind to people who are perhaps in the background. And I think that was something that Liberace's style was, shall we say, showy, and indeed the museum was full of very showy objects. But it was interesting to see that. So that was an unusual thing to do. I think the museum has since then been closed or fallen down or whatever happened.
Exploded.
Las Vegas isn't a very permanent place. But so that was interesting, because I do like when I go somewhere to do something sort of slightly unusual. You know, I don't want to see the usual sights. I'd like to see something a little bit unusual.
Somebody asked if you knew Liberace was from Milwaukee, and yes, that's why we asked the question.
I knew he was a famous son of Milwaukee.
And you do value you can see it in your writing. You do value kindness so much in your books.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the joys.
Well, I think kindness is terribly important, because I think the world in one view is a vale of tears. The world is full of confrontation and conflict, bitterness, hatred, and so on. Particularly, I think we've been feeling that in recent years, and in every country. I mean, throughout the world, people have been set against one another, divided, and have been using invective against one another. And I think that's a great pity, because the vast majority of people don't have those values. The vast majority of people appreciate kindness and they appreciate courtesy, and I hope that we can get back to that. We're in such a difficult situation at the moment where people are so anxious about everything, and we're seeing old enmities and hatreds being stirred up, and suspicion. We need to get back to kindness and love, because that is the only hope for humanity. Everything else is a mirage and is a false promise. We actually have to go back to appreciating one another. And I think, in my books, I like to talk about those values, because I think they exist in the Botswana books. People sometimes say to me, "Oh, you're a utopian writer. You're writing about people who are actually nice to one another." Well, people are nice to one another, in my experience, and particularly in Botswana. There are many people like Maramotswe, and they, generally speaking, people treat one another with courtesy and decency, and that you can portray that in fiction. You don't actually have to have the dysfunctional in order to make fiction readable. You can actually portray affirmative things, human joy and love and friendship. Friendship's a theme that I really find very interesting. I love writing about friendship.
And I think in these stories too, there's some gravity to some of them, but in every one of them, there's that moment of delight, and there's that little like moment of joy or discovery of some sort of laughter or happiness. And that really was a nice thing to read now. It really sort of carried me forward in that. It wasn't so dark.
Thank you.
So where are you finding delight right now?
Well, what in life or
yeah. What recent things have you that sort of went, wow, that was really wonderful?
Well, I think when this terrible period of isolation and difficulty started back in March, when we realized that we were facing a pandemic, or a pandemic had started, I happened to be reading a couple of books on monasticism. I was reading one of Patrick Leigh Fermore's books, A Time to Keep Silence, which was about visits that he paid in the 1950s to a number of monastic houses in France. And I was reading that, and I was reading also, as it happened, reading a book by a contemporary abbot of a monastery, talking about the relevance of monasticism for the 21st century. It's obviously not something that one immediately sees as being the spirit of the time. But what they were talking about was reflection and quiet. And so you can, irrespective of any religious issue there, it was actually the business of stopping and being by yourself and thinking, reflecting on life, and actually enjoying isolation or seclusion, not actually constantly being on the go. In fact, the one by the abbot talked about how extraordinarily busy our lives have become. We're rushing around all the time. We've got so much to do. And that we forget to savor the moment. Now, I think people have been feeling that about the pace of our life, even before this period of enforced quiet, in that the mindfulness movement was making a similar point, saying, stop rushing around in a circle and appreciate the moment. So it's a similar phenomenon. But so I've found this period of being fairly isolated, not being able to go and have lunch with my friends and things of that sort. I found it quite valuable, and I've done probably a bit more thinking than I've done for a long time, and I've certainly done more reading than I've done for a long time. It's given us time to read, and I expect you're probably dealing with people every day in your work, people who would say the same thing to you, say that they're able to savor books a little bit more in this period of quiet.
Yeah. And we've had a book here in the States, and I don't know if it's come to you yet, called Wintering. That's been really popular, that looks at wintering as a same sort of calming, slowing down. Yep. Yeah, in a monastic kind of way too. Yeah, but nature does it.
I think people are ready for that, and I think we probably didn't realize just how frantic our lives had become, how distracted we were. Mm-hmm. We'd become very distracted, and I think this has been quite a corrective. Now, of course, we might go back to our bad old ways. I don't know. Would hope that some of this would rub off. You know, I don't want to be thought to be naive about how we are, but I would hope that we've thought about the local, the importance of the local, thought about the importance of short supply lines, you know, eating food which we grow not too far away is a factor, not relying on too many imported fancy things. And people have gone beyond the notion of season in their food, which is in the old days we had strawberries for a brief period in the summer, and that was it. Nowadays, you expect, if you can't grow strawberries, then you expect them to be flown in from Kenya or wherever. And the notion of food miles then comes into, isn't it amazing how the absence of aviation, what a difference that has made, yes. How quiet places are, and how we can see the sky again, you know, without everything being crisscrossed with vapor trails.
Yeah.
It will be interesting to see what we remember to value when this is over. You know,
I agree, Daniel. The other thing which is going to really interest me is I'm really looking forward to reading the books that will be written over the next few years, talking about the research that I hope is going to be done into the effect on our social lives and our social networks, because I think there's been a deleterious effect. That's not a particularly good effect. I think our social networks have been interrupted really very, very badly. We've lost a sense of connection with other people, which I think
certainly has been an issue with schooling, with in-person schooling versus virtual, especially at the younger level. Yeah. And we're still fighting, you know, people trying to get people in school, not, you know, we just had Chicago's school system try to open, the teacher said, not yet. So, so I've certainly heard parents talk about it a lot, and I've heard teachers talk about it too. So, yeah, it'll be, but just the social connections. And it is, you know, as much as we do really love these virtual events, but there is something very nice about seeing the people in person. The same thing for family gatherings and things like that.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, and certainly as far as the literary events are concerned, I'm certainly looking forward to getting back to the physical events, because there's nothing to beat the actual meeting somebody in the flesh. I love meeting the readers and hearing what the readers have got to say, and that's terribly important, and that can't happen too soon, really, as far as I'm concerned. Much as I like these events, I think the real events will be very welcome when we can have them again.
Well, you have a number of opportunities. I was looking at your schedule for what was coming out this year, and I got to, so this Pianos and Flowers came out. Then you have Your Inner Hedgehog, which is the Professor Dr. Moritz Maria von Igerfeld series on April 6th. May 4th is Tiny Tales, which is another collection, I guess. June 15th, the reprint of Geometry of Holding Hands. July 20th, the new Detective Varg novel, The Man with the Silver Sob. The next #1 ladies detective agency book scheduled for October 26th. And you said there's a collection of poetry coming too, which hasn't yet been scheduled. How do you do it? And what would you like to talk up? What do you particularly love? What should people know about, of course, the #1 ladies series, but, and some of the other books have done really well too. But what do you feel like is like if you said, aside from this book, which everybody should buy, what's one that you'd love to talk a little more about?
Well, I very much like my Scandinavian series, the Ulf Varg series. The first one was the Department of Sensitive Crimes. Second one was The Talented Mr. Varg. And then this third one, which is going to be coming out whenever you said it was, that's The Man with the Silver Sob. And I decided to write about a Swedish detective because we were all taking such interest in Swedish detectives on television, on the various streaming channels full of Swedish detectives. So I decided to create my own Swedish detective called Ulf Varg, which means, Ulf means wolf in Danish and Varg means wolf in Swedish. So he's Wolf Wolf. And it's just such fun. I've had such fun with him. He's got a dog called Martin. Swedish detectives usually have a lot of problems. In fact, they really won't be employed unless they've got issues. They have to have psychological issues. It's a requirement of the job. And Ulf's got this dog. Ulf is having therapy, of course, and his dog is having therapy as well. And his dog is hearing impaired. He's the only dog in Sweden who's been taught to lip read. He's the only lip reading dog in Sweden. So you get the idea.
Very silly.
And then I've got the other one, which I've got the book of poetry, which has already been published in the UK, but which will come out in the US in the fall. That's called In a Time of Distance. And that's a collection of poems, because I write quite a few poems, and the poems I use sometimes in my Scotland Street novels. And could I quickly read one?
Please.
I'd like to read one which is called The Language of Pilots. And the background, it's short, I can assure you. That sprang from my being on an aeroplane and hearing the language which is used by the pilots and the cabin crew to talk to the passengers. It's not really the sort of language that we'd use in talking to people normally. It's a rather artificial language. So they say, rather than saying now, they say at this time, that sort of thing. Now, who says at this time? We say now. So they, rather than saying we're now going down, which of course is not something that one would want to hear on an airplane. They will say, we're now, at this time, we are commencing our descent. It's a very sort of clunky, artificial language. And it occurred to me as I sat there in this plane that wouldn't it be nice if a pilot would use poetic language in addressing the people in the plane? And I wrote this, The Language of Pilots, there and then, about what would happen if the pilot were a poet and he is addressing the passengers. They speak with high authority, ailerons and wings responsive to their touch. Their words are functional. But why, I wonder, should a pilot not be a poet too and say, we now descend at last through banks of cloud, white fields as wide as any ocean, at least when viewed from where we are, at least when viewed from this suspended point, for it is Bernoulli's principle that lifts and keeps us here. between the patient earth below and this empty, soaring sky. Ladies and gentlemen, rain falls in distant vales. Look from your windows to the starboard side of this metal tube we call an aircraft. Look out there and see the rain, the gray-white shafts of rain. Do you know that those wisps of cloud you see up above are crystals of ice falling like gossamer? Did you know that? Now please about your waists affix the belts you must, as slowly towards the earth we drop, to land's embrace, your belts adjust. We are a little late, but what are a few minutes, nothing more here and there. Not much, I think. Goodbye, and take with you the things you brought, your few possessions. Goodbye until we meet again. And once more we carry you on wings of steel, to places you would wish to go. Goodbye, dear friends. It matters not whether you're a member of the loyalty scheme we've got. We love you all as parents love their children equally. Remember that, and please come back. Goodbye again, and cabin crew, unbar the doors, let light be seen, secure what needs securing, and cross-check whatever that might mean. Goodbye, for soon these great engines on landing will be silenced, as will I. That's the poetic pilot.
I loved it. You're on mute
It's coming
still?
out. No, I've caught it.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
It's coming out this fall.
Yeah.
We were going to ask you, Lisa, you were going to ask, what are you reading?
Oh, I was going to say, ask, what are you reading right now?
Well,
and you were prepared.
I had it, I genuinely had this on my desk. This isn't all set up, this isn't arranged. I genuinely had it. Let me assure the readers that this is not acting. I
will confess that it happened by chance.
It happened by I have a book which I gather is going to be discussed tomorrow in one of the stalls, I think. Anyway, it's Simon Winchester's Land, and that's what I'm reading right at the moment. I haven't got very far because I only got it yesterday or the day before, and I've been distracted by various things. And indeed, I'm so enjoying it. A very good test of whether a book is good is if you go ahead and read some of the chapters out of sequence, if you go ahead and read some of the pages in advance. And I've done that with this book. I've dipped into the subsequent pages. But Simon Winchester writes really beautifully. And it's all about how important land is to us and how controversial it can be. Land ownership can be, issues of land, issues of territory. It's a fascinating book. So it's something which I really can thoroughly recommend. It's a remarkable book.
Having read
Daniel's just put the link up for his event tomorrow night.
I want people to go. And he is also a very charming man.
Good.
He pales in charm compared to you, but he's okay. He's pretty charming. There is a wonderful chapter. It's almost like a survey more than a narrative history. And there is a wonderful chapter on what's going on in Scotland, the history of land use in Scotland and some of the experiments the government is doing there. I think the first chapter is about the history of the land that he buys.
Yes.
In the Western Berkshires, like almost in New York State. I guess
that's right.
Yeah.
Mind you, that was really very interesting. That was a very good way of doing it. I mean, he immediately gets your attention. It's the opposite of a dry survey of the topic. It's really, really lively. And the way that he describes how he eventually bought 100 and something acres or whatever it was in New York State, very rough country, which had been used as a sort of hunting reserve, really, rather than cultivated. And his feeling of ownership and his feeling of satisfaction when he gets the title deed. And then that leads him to ask all sorts of questions about why do we feel this about land, and controversial issues of ownership, because if you look at any bit of land anywhere in the world, at some stage, somebody will have taken that from somebody else.
Right.
I think it's a universal thing. Absolutely every title of land, a land title that you look at, is going to be based ultimately on some act of dispossession of the people who were there before. And this goes all the way back. So in Scotland, we've got that in Scotland, where there were what were called clearances, where large landowners put people off the land and replaced them with sheep, and it still is an issue in Scotland.
Yeah, he really tries to confront, I think, in a more contemporary way, colonialism, and as actually you certainly do that in your first story as well, in Pianos and Flowers. I actually had seen a bit of a tie about sort of looking from a more modern perspective about how various countries treated other people.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at human history, it's a pretty appalling story of people treating other people not particularly well. I think that we've had a relatively short period that we've been very fortunate to live through, where the notion of human rights has been taken pretty seriously. Now, of course, human rights, that goes way back to rights of man discussion and into the 18th century, but we've had this period in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, and the beginning of the 21st century, where we've been very sensitive to human rights claims. But it's the exception. Yeah. It's the exception to human history where it wasn't the. So let's hope we've made moral progress. Not that we can make any assumptions about the continuation of this. I mean, it's fragile. It's very, very fragile.
Mm-hmm. I know this is, I shouldn't ask you about other books, but you speak so much about kindness and friendship. Did you read my new obsession? Did you read Leonard and Hungry Paul, the Ronan Hession book?
No.
It's an Irish book. It just got named One Book, One Dublin. And I just think you'd like it.
What is it called again?
It's called Leonard and Hungry Paul.
Yes. No, interestingly enough, I saw a review of that yesterday. And I would like to, because apparently it's about two rather nice men who, that sounds like the sort of book that I'd like to read. And on your recommendation, Daniel, I shall
go
read.
For it.
I will definitely read that. Thank you for the recommendation.
Lisa, do you have a final question?
I don't think I do, which wouldn't open up to a larger conversation. I just think it's been really nice and delightful, and I appreciate your perspective on how you tell stories from the brighter side of life.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I've enjoyed our conversation greatly. I mean, we've had a very good broad agenda. We've dealt with many topics and satisfactorily solved many of them.
We could probably talk to you for another 2 hours, right, Lisa?
Yeah. And I look forward to the book of poetry. I really enjoyed that poem, and I look forward to that. Much. Yes.
Somebody mentioned they won't be able to fly again without thinking about it. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
And honestly, if we could start the Alexander McCall Smith Book Club, we could probably meet weekly, I guess, to catch up.
You two are kind. And I very much hope on my next American tour, I find myself in your part of the country.
It would be an honor.
We'll be able to have a we'll all go and have dinner and continue our conversation exactly where we've left
where we've left off.
If somebody's been keeping the minutes of our meeting, then we can.
Well, the beauty is this recording is taped.
Yeah,
we'll be posting it. So we can go back and check.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you, Lisa. And until we meet again.
Until we meet again.
Until we meet again. Thank you all for coming to our event. We wouldn't have bookstores without you, and we hope to see you at another virtual event. And don't forget about Pianos and Flowers, which are available on both websites. Oh, and by the way, with the folks out there, if you want to buy the book at your favorite independent, wherever it might be. So
yes,
we love to support
please.
other independent bookstores. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Good night to you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.